Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 4 at Knee Pit Gaming. And today is our very first NASCAR Heat 4 setup video. And I thought I would choose Daytona to start with since it is easily one of the most popular tracks in the game for most people. And it's a good place to get started. So you see on the screen, I've run 3 races total in the Cup Series here. That's 3 full races. I've run several other races testing things out, but generally not a full race. 2 wins and the 105 speed rating. And I can tell you the speed rating at Daytona or Talladega really doesn't mean much of anything, because here that time is all about the draft and where you are in the pack, what kind of run you're getting on the group in front of you, who's behind you, all that sort of thing. In fact, the one race I have not won in the Cup Series here was basically me starting from the rear, holding back, and having no goal other than to try to create a huge run to see what kind of lap time I could generate. That was the only goal of that race, and that got me to the 105 speed rating. Otherwise, the setup I'm going to show you guys, the AI cannot keep up with me. What generally happens is I start somewhere in the top 5. The AI qualifying usually varies by a couple of tenths, 2 to 3 tenths between races. So sometimes I'm on the pole, sometimes I might be starting 5th, but within a few laps I'm in the lead, and they simply can't keep up with me in order to get a strong enough draft to run fast times. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the setup. Let's start off by talking a little bit about lap times. Again, at this track, it's all dependent on the draft. So what I'm going to talk about are the times alone in qualifying. That way you have no interference from the draft and you can get a real read on how fast the car is by itself. Now that goal time of 44.2 that you see there, you need to hit that time to get the 105 rating. However, it's not all that difficult. As long as you find yourself back in the pack with cars both ahead of you and behind you, you should have no issues getting to that time. And in fact, a good bit faster is certainly possible. So lap times in all 3 series we're going to talk about today. Cup cars. Again, alone on the track, somewhere around a 45.5. There's a little bit more speed there, I feel like, but for me, once I realized they were having a hard enough time keeping up with me in the race, it didn't make much sense to continue looking for more speed. So around a 45.5 should get you somewhere in the top 5 starting and may even get you on the pole. Xfinity cars, 46.7 will get you again at the very front of the pack, and then finally the trucks, somewhere around a 48.8 will find you at the front of the pack with no issues whatsoever with the AI. Now that is very unfortunate to say about the AI, but that's simply where we are right now in the game. Now let's move on to the setup itself. So because I'm on the Xbox, I'm going to press the X key, and that's going to bring up our setup options. Now we do have, just as in years past, the option for a qualifying setup and a race setup. And for Daytona, we really don't need those, as I can use easily the same setup in both. But for some of the other tracks that we'll be dealing with in the future, we may very well have 2 very separate setups, just to show you some of the differences in various settings that you can use. But for now, we're going to choose the race setup, and here we go. You have a ton of options here. There are only a few things that really affect the speed, and one of those is the tire pressure. You can see 60 pounds, which is max pressure all around. That causes really no issues at all with the handling of the car. It should, but unfortunately in the game it does not. So you can simply run the max, which lowers your rolling resistance and gives you more overall speed. The rest of everything else we're going to talk about, for the most part, other than the gearing and the camber, is really all about your comfort and how you want the car to drive. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a few things. Now, shock settings, I could have gone all over the board. I've tested anywhere from 10 to 15 all the way down to the 3.5 settings that I used quite a bit in NASCAR Heat 3. They all work just fine, and again, it's going to come down to how you want the car to handle. The reason I've left them fairly soft, using a 5.7 combination on the front and 3.5 in the rear, is simply because I wanted to go for comfort for you guys. But definitely feel free to try out much more aggressive higher number shocks on this, as you will get quicker reactions, and for some of you that will be what you're looking for. Moving on to the weight settings, here the goal was simply comfort. I wanted to make the car as stable as I could, and that means generally using more front weight and more wedge. Again, this really isn't going to affect your speed very much at all unless you get really loose or really tight. So anywhere in a pretty wide range, you're going to be perfectly fine. If you find that the car is getting too loose, particularly with the maxed out air pressures, then simply come in here, add a little bit of front weight or add some wedge. That is a quick way to tighten the car up overall and slow down the rotation of the car as you enter the corner in particular. Moving on to the spring settings, we're using what in my area of the country we call hillbilly setup, which is using a stiffer left front than right front, which is something I've done in the past, but not quite as much, I don't believe, in Heat 3. Now, I didn't consult any of my NASCAR Heat 3 setups. When I did this, I started with a blank slate, and here's where I ended up, is kind of the way all of this happened. Rear springs are basically maxed out. That's essentially what I did here. Again, just going for comfort. If the car is getting loose and you've tried the front weight and the wedge adjustment, come in here and reduce the rear springs, particularly the right rear, and that should help tighten the car up and make it more stable. But again, here the stiffer platform really holds the speed and is pretty good overall, but some people will prefer a softer spring package just to get a little bit more comfort in there. Moving on to the miscellaneous settings, and you can see +8 and -8 on the camber, and yes, that is maximum camber. I very badly wanted that not to work this year, but it does. One caveat to that is you don't necessarily have to use max camber in order to have a car that is fast and stable. I have used all the way down to about 2 or 3 on the camber on the left front or right front and was perfectly fine. So it's not a huge issue, but it does contribute to the speed. So keep that in mind. You lower the camber, and in all likelihood, you're taking some speed out of the car. Now, front sway bar is at 1.315, which is a little bit bigger bar than I have been using in the past. But I have found that for Daytona in NASCAR Heat 4, 1.315 really helped the stability of the car and helped the rotation of the car to keep that steady without over-rotating and scrubbing off speed. Moving on to the track bar, 12 inches on the left, 13 inches on the right. Again, if you find yourself getting loose overall, then drop that track bar, particularly the right side track bar, and that should help snug the car up and make it more stable for you. Brake bias is really more of a personal preference. I tend not to use it a whole lot. I prefer just simply to lift off the throttle a little bit if I need to. But the brake bias, the higher this number is, the more front brake you're going to put in it, which is going to make the car tighter under braking. Here at Daytona, if you're dragging the brake in the draft, then that might make the car a little bit tight in the corner, so keep that in mind. If you find that you're dragging the brake and the car just won't turn very good, then drop this number down into the 60s or even below and test that out and see if that doesn't help you out some. Grill tape, this is much like the camber, something I really wanted to be able to tell you guys has a lot of effect, but from my experience it has no effect whatsoever. In fact, if it does have any effect, it is so small that any other changes will easily overcome it. So grill tape is at 65%, which is the maximum that I have run, and you're still perfectly fine and should not get any engine warnings. But of course, if you do, then simply drop that by 5 or 10% and you'll be perfectly fine with no ill effects to the handling. And again, that is very unfortunate to say because I was very much looking forward to that changing. Wheel lock is at 10 degrees, pretty standard for me. That feels good for me. Feel free to increase or decrease that just depending on the feel that you're looking for. Steering offset is at 0.05. I generally increase this in relation to the camber I'm running, but 0.05 seems to be pretty good and allows me to tug on the wheel just a little bit on the straightaway to keep the car in exactly a straight line. But feel free to increase that. I've used as high as 0.1 or maybe even a touch higher than that, and it should be perfectly fine. Again, it's a feel thing, and go with whatever feels the best for you. Gear settings, 1 through 4, I didn't touch at all. My standard is to use fourth gear as a 1-to-1 ratio, but at this particular track in particular, you're going to have the possibility of using a different fourth gear, so not a 1-to-1 ratio. You might want to come in and use particularly a 0.95, maybe even a 0.9, and the reason is I'm using the minimum gear here. So 2.8, the tallest gear I can get, and it's possible to get even lower numbers, but of course then you have to start playing around with the combination of the two and going through that. I chose to keep it simple for the purposes of this setup, but that option is there. You can get actually a final ratio equivalent to less than 2.8. The engine power band seems to be somewhere between 7,000 and 7,500, so try to keep it in there as much as you can, and your speed should be really good. So, as is the case generally for Daytona or Talladega, I'm using the same setup in general for the Cup, Xfinity, and trucks. You might find that you adjust the gearing a little bit between Xfinity and trucks as opposed to Cup, but I have found that using the same gear really works just fine. So as always, adjust to your comfort level. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our support for NASCAR Heat 4.